We're back in our study in the Gospel of Luke. It's been a few weeks since I've updated this, but we've been going through and looking at one chapter of the Gospel of Luke each week, and because there's so much information there, you really just have to pick out one story and run with it. And so that's kind of what we've been doing as we've gone through it. And today I'm going to be catching up and teaching a couple of different sessions on this. And so one of the things that's really important to remember is, and I've entitled the whole series, The Coming and Present Kingdom, is that Luke is presenting a case that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish Messiah, the hoped for Messiah. And so he is taking the events that he knows about, the events that maybe he witnessed, and he is writing them down in a way that will allow the Jews who read this to understand Jesus' role in fulfilling the prophecies of the Messiah. He is also making sure that the Jews and the Gentiles, which are those who are not Jews, are realizing that Jesus is not just the Jewish Messiah, but that he has come to be the Messiah of the world. And in that, he's a little bit distinct from the other gospel writers in the way that he presents the different opportunities that Jesus had to engage with others, specifically in the way that he engages the Pharisees. And so we're going to see that a little bit more today in Luke chapter 17, and we're going to look at the coming kingdom of God. I'm not sure if you could hear that or not, but the music was just a touch loud. So we're going to pick it up in verse 20 of Luke 17. Once, on being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, "The coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor will people say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is in your midst." Then he said to his disciples, "The time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. People will tell you, 'There he is,' or 'Here he is.' Do not go running off after them. For the Son of Man in his day will be like the lightning which flashes and lights up the sky from one end to the other. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just like this on the day the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, no one who is on the housetop with possessions inside should go down to get them. Likewise, no one in the field should go back for anything. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night, two people will be in one bed. One will be taken, and the other left. Two women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken, and the other left. Where, Lord? They asked. He replied, where there is a dead body, there the vultures will gather. This is a very interesting passage, and I'm quite a little timid to go into it because I can recite all the things that I've heard over the years, all the different ways I've heard this taught, and tell you that this is the way. But even those people, I think they would have to come to some agreement that there's a lot of multi-layered ways of looking at this passage, or possibilities of looking at this passage. And so I'm going to take what I think is the most straightforward approach. Luke is dealing with the specific reality, was Jesus the Messiah? That's the reality that he's dealing with. And so he's going to address it from the Pharisees' point of view and what Jesus said to them. And then he's going to look at the disciples and what Jesus said to them. And then we're going to look at those two together and see how this answers this question. And I say that because when it gets down to that two, one will be taken, the other left, that's been used in a lot of things that talk about the possibility of the end of the world and things like that. I think we'll see in this passage today that, at least in the way that Jesus and the time he originally said it, whether it had that meaning or not, I'll leave that to others to argue about, but it had a very specific meaning for this time and this period of people. And that's the way we want to look at things. What did it mean to them? How does that apply to us? And how does that stick to us? What is the point of it? So the Pharisees are there, and they're basically saying, when is God's kingdom coming? Okay, so you say you're the Messiah. Where is your throne? Where is your army? Where is these laws that you're going to bring into effect? How are you going to make your kingdom? And this is what they're asking Jesus about. And so they're kind of insulting him. Every king has an army. Every king has a throne. Every king ultimately has a lineage. Jesus wasn't married. What exactly does your kingdom look like? Which now Jesus has told them multiple times what his kingdom looks like, and they've just rejected it. And so he has this statement to say to them. He says this: the coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor will people say, here it is or there it is, because the kingdom of God is already in your midst. Jesus said, you guys are looking for the wrong thing. You're waiting on some herald, some big shot to stand up and say, this is the kingdom of God. He's like, that's not going to happen. And the reason that's not going to happen is because the kingdom of God is already in your midst. Now, the kingdom of God was already in their midst. How? Well, the kingdom of God was in their midst through the person of Jesus Christ, who he was, the role he had, and what he was doing in his world at that time. And so he said to them, you guys are waiting for this great announcement. You're waiting on proof that I'm a king. I'm already here. There's no announcement. This is the announcement. Now, he could have gone back and pointed them to the wise men. He could have pointed them to the shepherds and the stories that they would have still been able to hear about that 30 plus years later. But he didn't. He just said, I'm already here. You're not getting a bigger announcement than this. And this was important to the Pharisees. And one of the reasons it was important is they didn't believe God's kingdom could come until the Romans were gone. And every corner you looked at had a Roman soldier on it. So therefore the kingdom of God wasn't present. They believed that God's kingdom would come about by recruiting more members to agree and participate in the way that they practiced the law and the way that they practiced the Torah. And they were looking around, and not enough people were converting to their view of their Pharisaical plans. And so they said, this can't be the kingdom of God. And while at the same time, and you can go back and read the previous chapters, Jesus was living among them and healing people on the Sabbath day, and they were arguing with him over whether or not that was correct to do. So you can see Jesus' frustration with them, that their religiosity, their performance, their tradition had even blocked out their view of being able to see God at work. And this is very important, because we have this problem today. And when I say we, I'm talking specifically of me. I'm talking specifically of the local church that I'm teaching at. I'm talking about the association that our church is associated with, the denomination that we're associated with, and then Christians in general. We often think and act as if outside influencers control or manipulate God's work. Since I was a teen, I have heard in every election cycle that this person is, quote-unquote, God's man or God's person to, quote-unquote, protect us, to preserve us. And we've succumbed to all sorts of ideas and thoughts and pursuits in this belief that some outside person is going to manipulate or control God's work. And because of this, we rarely, we don't speak to truth. For example, one of the things that's been in the news lately is the behavior of Ravi Zacharias and the awful things that he had done while he was leading his group, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And, it's amazingly sad to me how many believers won't look and say what that man did is wrong. They just won't do it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it until it was actually, poured out in front of them and all the hideousness and ugliness was exposed. Because we're afraid to police ourselves. We think that we have to protect our resources, and as if God is some resource that has to be protected, and we're going to run out of God if we're not careful or something. I don't know. We fail to act on the truths and responsibility that we have. Jesus was telling the Pharisees the kingdom of God is already here, and the responsibilities we have: love our neighbors, love our enemies, love others, care for others. And Jesus showed them this. I mean, people would show up in the synagogue on a Sabbath day ill, and Jesus would look at them and like, should I heal them? And the Pharisees were like, no, you shouldn't heal them. It's our day to show off. And Jesus is like, that's so wrong. And we deal with that today. We say, should I talk to that person? Should I be kind to that person? Can I disagree with that person and still love them? And so if I'm going to do that, then how do I disagree with them in a way that proves to them and reminds them that I love them? Do I keep my mouth shut sometimes? Do I, how do I do those things? and the reminder that God is always at work. We look at this as, we need a person to bring revival. We need a performance to bring revival. We need a persuasive message, and using my P's here, persuasive message to bring a revival, instead of noting the fact that God is always at work and being on the lookout for that. Being on the lookout where God is literally doing things, where things that are uncomfortable are happening, and yet people's lives are being changed, and people are being encouraged, and people are being healed, and people are being strengthened. Okay, so that's why that's important to us. So then he turns it around. Jesus does, and he says something to the disciples. And he says this. It's the opposite. And this is so interesting. The music just kept getting louder and louder and louder. So Jesus says this to his disciples. He's like, on the contrary to you guys, the time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man. What is one of the days of the Son of Man? Well, I think it's two things. Jesus knows that he's about to die. He knows that he's going to die. He's going to give up his life. He's going to come back from the dead. But he's no longer going to be physically present. The disciples are not going to see him in person anymore. And so he tells them this. He's like, people are going to tell you, I'm over here or I'm over there, and you're going to go chasing looking for me. And you say, now that sounds weird. Well, okay, let's put this in perspective. Jesus was buried, okay? And 3 days later, he rose from the dead. The disciples all saw him. They all saw him multiple times. Many other people saw him. For 40 days, you can go read about it in the Gospels and go read about it in the book of Acts. For 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus stayed in physical contact with the people who had followed him. They met, they talked, they had teachings. He exposed and taught them about truth, about his role and the things that he was doing. You can go and read that in the Gospels. It says for up to 40 days he appeared unto them. Okay? And then he rose up into heaven. He was gone. That was it. He didn't come back anymore. So Jesus is telling them that what you're going to happen is you're going to hear people say, hey, Jesus is over in such and such an area. He's over in Samaria. And a bunch of people are going to run over there looking for Jesus. He's like, and then people are going to tell you, no, Jesus is over here in this area. He's over there at the Dead Sea. And a bunch of people are going to go over there looking for Jesus. And he's like, I'm not going to be there. You think that that's what you want. That's not what's going to happen. He says, don't go running after them. And he gives them this illustration. And I think it's a beautiful illustration. He says, because I'm like the lightning. What do you mean the lightning? Well, I mean, the lightning is there and then it's gone. And he's saying that, it's not that he's not going to physically be there. It's that he's going to work in such a way that it's like boom, 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 all over the place, and he's gone. So you're not going to chase him down. You can't chase down the lightning, okay? So he gives them this visual thing. And then he begins to turn towards what this situation is leading up to. And I think that Jesus is pointing towards the destruction of the temple that's going to happen about 35 years after his death. And it is the culmination of the destruction. The Jews never worshipped in the temple again. They have yet to rebuild and redo the sacrifices or anything like that. The Romans are coming in 70 AD, and they're literally just going to burn everything to the ground. And Jesus is pointing towards that. And so he says to them, just as it was in the days of Noah. In other words, people are just going to be going about their lives, okay? They're just going to be doing whatever it is that they felt was appropriate, and all of a sudden this destruction is going to come. And then he says, just like it was in the days of light. And so he gives them two apocalyptic symbols that all of the Jews would have known about. Noah, the destruction of the world. Lot, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and brimstone. And so Jesus says to them, people are just going to be going about their lives, doing their thing, and they're going to be doing whatever it is that they think is appropriate at the time, and all of a sudden destruction is just going to sweep over the land. And this is what he's pointing towards, and this is what literally happened in 70 AD as the Romans surrounded Jerusalem and just destroyed the place. And then he gives them this example that I think that he says this, when the Son of Man is revealed, in other words, when Jesus proves that he is who he says he is, one of the final proofs of that is going to be the destruction of the temple. Because he now is the presence of God among his people. You don't need the physical temple anymore. And so he says to them, one is on the housetop, don't run down inside to get your possessions. Just get out of town. You see the Roman army coming, get out. Don't try and go back inside and get a couple dollar bills or get some loaves of bread or whatever. Run for the hills. And then he talks about two people in a bed, two people grinding. And oftentimes we look at this as a portrayal of the end of the world, and those who are taken into heaven, and those who are not taken are left here for destruction. Except that that's not really how it's portrayed. One will be taken and the other left. The one that's taken is the one that's destroyed. The one that's left is the one who lives, as you look at this passage. And then he goes back, and so he basically is telling them that they can't avoid this potential coming disaster, and they can't avoid the judgment of God that's coming on Israel. And I think if you go back and look at verses 7 through 10 of this passage, you will get a picture of what he's saying here, because he tells them this story. So he gives them this story, and it's in Luke 17, beginning in verse 5. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you." And then he gives them this. He says, "Suppose that one of you has a servant who is plowing or looking after the sheep." In other words, you have somebody that works for you, and they're out doing a task. "When the servant comes in from the field, will you say, 'Come, sit down and eat'? Or would you say, 'Go finish fixing my meal, and then take care of me, and after I'm done, then you eat and drink'?" Now, he's given them a scenario he wants them to think about, and we'll talk about that. "Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to you? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty.'" So the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Lord, give us more faith." In other words, a little helping of faith over here. And Jesus is like, "Well, your responsibility is to do what you're supposed to do, to live where you're at." And I think this is kind of the conclusion of this view of Luke 17. The Pharisees are looking for a coming king to just come blasting in and knock everybody out of place. The disciples are looking for a king who's always going to be present, always going to be holding their hands. And Jesus is like, "No, you're my servants. Go and do what I've told you to do. Love others, care for others. And when you come back," he gives them illustrations like, so if your servant goes out into the field, when he comes back from the field, you're not going to say, "Hey, buddy, sit down and eat." You're going to say, "Hey, buddy, where's my meal?" Because he's your servant. He works for you. And so Jesus said, "You are my servants." And so the responsibility you have is to quit trying to figure out exactly what God is doing and how God is doing it, but rather commit yourselves to the task that he's given you and push forward in those ways. That's the way I hope that I understand it. That's the way I take it in His Scripture.